He's like a butterfly flapping his wings deep down into the forest, man. It's gonna cause a tree fall like 5,000 miles away, man. There ain't nobody seeing nobody. Man, see, like, you don't even know, man. It's like you're born into this world, man. And you got like that, man. The dust and wind, man. Or like the dang old candle, man. It don't matter, man. It's all the time.
All right, Scott Horton, welcome back to the Jay Burden Show. How you doing, man?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I'm glad to have you back on. Obviously, there's a lot happening in the world of foreign policy, but I thought it'd be important to sort of take a step back and talk about a man who, unfortunately, just left the world, no longer alive. Dick Cheney has shuffled off this mortal coil. And when I was thinking about it, I realized that for a lot of people my age, Dick Cheney is not really a figure in their minds. He's just some old guy. Whereas if you talk to people who are even just a few years older, he's sort of Satan himself. And so I thought it'd be interesting, now that he's no longer with us, to sort of dig into Dick Cheney, explain why he is an important figure, and really, how he earned that infamous reputation.
Sure. Well, I'm your guy for that because I'm stuck in 2002 always and for the rest of my life. The great real year and a half actually between September 11th and the launch of Iraq War II, where they just spent that year and a half browbeating everyone into essentially pretending to be afraid that Iraq was going to attack us if we didn't launch a preemptive attack on them first. The lesson of September 11th is that we got to start all the wars from now on, or else something like that could happen again. And the whole thing was just completely idiotic. And anyone who actually knew anything about it knew that Saddam Hussein had nothing whatsoever to do with Osama bin Laden, and was in fact, for good reason, terrified of bin Ladenite style terrorism. And they essentially just used the grief and the fear generated by the September 11th attack to exploit. They really, there's so many people became 9/11 truthers simply because they could see that they might as well have done it themselves. The degree to which they were willing to lie to your mom and dad and try to make them afraid so as to support a war against a country that had nothing to do with it. Is like the worst thing, or equivalent to the worst kind of government action that you could think of, including, FDR exploiting, and really, I think in that case, certainly turning a blind eye to the incoming Pearl Harbor attack or something like that, exploiting an accident on the battleship Maine in order to steal Cuba and the Philippines, and this kind of just absolutely cynical, treacherous behavior by American leaders. And so and Dick Cheney was known at that time, of course, in the W. Bush years, as really driving when it came to foreign policy, that W. Bush had clearly outsourced that. And I'll tell you, by the way, that in the election of 2000, what people thought they were voting for was Colin Powell to drive and choose what our foreign policy would be. They trusted him, but they weren't getting him. They were getting Dick Cheney, and with Dick Cheney, the neocon network that lied us into war. And so the backstory here is the guy's from Wyoming, and he got a job. I forget if he had been a congressman for a little while first, or he'd gone to Washington and gotten a job working for Donald Rumsfeld in the Gerald Ford administration. And so Rumsfeld was his mentor, basically, in power there. And then with the advent of the Jimmy Carter years, he went and joined Republican Party politics. And I forget which year he ran for Congress, but he ended up winning a seat in the Congress. And so through the Reagan years, he was a congressman, or through most of them anyway, he was a congressman rather than a member of the administration. But then when Reagan was gone, his successor was George H.W. Bush Sr., his vice president. So it was like his third term, essentially. And almost all of the principal national security guys from the Reagan administration came over into the Bush Sr. administration, except for Dick Cheney came from the House. And Bush brought him in to be Secretary of Defense. Go ahead.
Just one interjection. I'm sure you know this. George Bush Sr., where did he sort of make his bones, right? Where did he sort of rise to national prominence? Because that's relevant as well, right?
Yeah. Well, speaking of bones, first at Skull and Bones.
That was not intentional, but we'll consider it an Easter egg, right?
Sure. Yes. Well, he was Prescott's son. His father was a senator, and he had, I think, been a congressman for a little while and lost for Senate, if I remember it correctly. And this was after his career in oil. And then he was named ambassador to China and then ambassador to the United Nations. No. I'm sorry. I think that's right. I think he was ambassador to the UN for a minute. Check me on that. I think I know that, but the last time I learned that was a very long time ago, if I have that right. But then he was named to be director of Central Intelligence. Now, at that time, it wasn't just director of CIA. It was director of Central Intelligence, meaning he was the boss of the CIA, but he was also the boss of all the different intelligence agencies, sort of like the National Intelligence Director role supposedly is now, which they changed that after September 11th. Anyway, so he was named DCI, and what's very interesting about that is that the great journalist Andrew Coburn from Harper's, and who's a great author and brother of Alex Coburn and Patrick Coburn, he wrote a book called Rumsfeld, His Rise, Fall, and Catastrophic Legacy. And check him out on Substack. Spoils of War is his Substack, by the way. And in Rumsfeld, he says that what was going on there actually was that Rumsfeld was exiling Bush Sr. to CIA because this is in the era right after Watergate and the Church and Rockefeller Commission reports on all the nefarious activities of the CIA, including all the MK Ultra stuff and Operation Chaos and all this stuff. So Rumsfeld did that in order to weaken a political enemy by tarring Bush with the label CIA that was meant to sabotage him and prevent him from being an opponent to Rumsfeld, who wanted to run for president in 1980, which I forget if he even tried to in 1980 or not now. But that was his intention, was to sabotage Bush Sr. That was how he became head of CIA, was Rumsfeld screwing him back then. And then Bush Sr. did, in fact, have to settle for vice president under Ronald Reagan, who got the nomination in 1980, of course. So anyway, but then, so he brings in Dick Cheney to be Secretary of Defense once Bush Sr. becomes president, after all, in 1989. And the first thing they do that year, I guess at the end of the first year in office, was launch the war against Panama. Now, I really should read a few books about this and be an expert on it, and I'm really not. But, I actually just interviewed Larry Johnson, who's the former CIA officer, a couple of weeks ago, and he just brought this all up unbidden and explained the relationship between America and Panama and how he worked for the United States, and then he screwed them, wasn't being cooperative anymore, so they decided to get rid of him. And I'll urge people to just go and check that out and see what Larry Johnson himself has to say about that. There's also a very good documentary about it called The Panama Deception that's narrated by Elizabeth Montgomery, the lady from Bewitched, which is really good. And she must have been some kind of leftist, I guess. It was made by Peter Dale Scott and those kind of guys, I think, in the very late 80s, early 90s, it would have been early 90s era. And then, I hate to say it, but the Bob Woodward book, The Commanders, actually has a lot about the decision-making on how they launched the Panama War, which I don't remember very well, but I know that the lesson was that was fun and easy, and it's with the Soviet Union falling apart and falling away, we can do whatever we want now. And that was the lesson of Panama that, very much informed their decision-making leading into Iraq War I. And, Cheney's role at the beginning of that was that he and Paul Wolfowitz tried to stop Saddam Hussein from invading Kuwait. But James Baker told him, go ahead, see if I care. And he was listening to Baker, not Cheney. And I think basically what happens, my best understanding, and people can read this in my book, Enough Already, I explain this, I hopefully better than I am right now, that I think that just Cheney and Wolfowitz were too late, that the CIA and Central Command in the region were encouraging Kuwaiti intransigence. And the State Department under Baker and April Glaspie, the ambassador, were encouraging Saddam Hussein that you don't have to take that from them. While at the same time, Wolfowitz was panicking, and the last thing he wanted was for Saddam Hussein to achieve a military success against a wealthy state, petrostate like Kuwait. and empower Iraq. And so he got Dick Cheney, I believe, I'm trying to remember specifically, but I think it was just Cheney got President Bush to write a letter to Saddam. But then they were like, oh no, because the letter wasn't worded strongly enough. It was still like kind of, oh, he could get mixed signals from that. And so then they tried to send another letter, but by then it was too late and he went ahead. And I don't believe that Iraq War I, that they really trapped him into it. Only in effect they did, due to like left hand, right hand discoordination between the departments in the way that all worked out. And then in the war, of course, Dick Cheney was Secretary of Defense and was part of what I'm sorry, I have to consider essentially a conspiracy by the administration, the president and his staff, to refuse to negotiate in good faith with Saddam Hussein for the entire second half of the year 1990. Once they started building up for the war and said, we're going to reverse this thing, then they wouldn't let him back out in a way that would let him save face at all in any way. And his demands got more and more and more minimal as the months went by, where in the end, he was only asking for America to promise that we would remove our forces and Israel would end its occupation of the Palestinians someday. And in exchange for that, he would withdraw his forces from Kuwait. And they're like, yeah, right. We're not going to reward this aggression with these kind of concessions. And so they would rather have a war than make a meaningless promise with no expiration date or implementation date whatsoever on it, right? And so that really was criminal. And that launched what turned out to be, an endless intervention in Iraq, which has never ended to this day. There have only been, I think in the year 2013 might have been the only year that we didn't bomb Iraq at all. Our guys still go out on missions there against the Islamic State. And so you can't say they're bombing like the country of Iraq, but they're bombing the country of Iraq. You know what I mean? We have been setting off high explosives on that territory virtually every single year, obviously at different rates, but essentially we have been intervening there ever since then. And Dick Cheney was a huge part of that. And now I really should read his memoir. I don't know how honest he would be about any of this. And maybe I need to go back and read more original reporting about what all were his opinions about what should be done at the end of the war in terms of encouraging the Shiite uprising, in terms of the decision to betray that uprising when they realized that Iraqis who had taken Iran's side in the Iran-Iraq war were coming across the border, and the decision to, essentially call the war off where they did. People like Paul Wolfowitz and many others said we should have gone all the way to Baghdad. George W. Bush, the president's son, also believed that. George Bush Jr., they called him then, also believed you should have gone all the way to Baghdad. For political reasons, he thought that. You're in the middle of a war, you get reelected. But Bush Sr., he had a 90% approval rating at the end of the war in early 1991. But he wasn't going to stand for election until the end of 92. And by then, Bill Clinton was able to, all that war hero shine was all worn off, and it was the economy, stupid. And, he lost to, probably a massive Hezbollah campaign on behalf of Bill Clinton, actually. But anyway, that's a separate story. You could ask me if you want what I know about that part. But I should say that I know this about Cheney on Iraq War I, that he did a podcast. Somebody should save all this, archive it, .org, whatever, .is, before the memory hole gets it. But Bill Kristol interviewed Dick Cheney for his podcast a few years back. And it's like really long, in-depth thing. They go for a few hours. And it's great because they talk about everything except Iraq War II, which they don't mention at all. There's like, they don't even go, let's just not even talk about that. They're just like, nah, just whoever heard of that? Nobody did that. What did Bill Kristol and Dick Cheney know about Iraq War II? Nothing worth remarking on. Anyway, but they talk about everything else. And when they talk about Iraq War I, they talk about how Cheney says it wasn't even James Baker. It was he who told the king of Saudi Arabia that I swear that when we're done pushing Iraq out of Kuwait, we will leave. We will not stay at our bases in Saudi Arabia, which they already had some bases in Saudi, but they were all under the pretext that they weren't. Americans are only there because they're, doing maintenance, when really it was an American base, but they were, covert. But this whole thing about permanent bases on the peninsula to wage the massive Iraq War I Desert Storm campaign. We're going to close all that down. Cheney himself says that he is the one who promised the king that we'll leave. And then they did not leave. And they immediately came up with the pretext that we have to protect the Shiites. And part of it was because they had just built up such propaganda against Saddam Hussein that even though this guy had been our client from 1980 through 1990, halfway through 1990, and had even been a CIA client going back to 1958 off and on, if you want to get technical with it, but who had absolutely, gotten a green light from Jimmy Carter to launch the Iraq War and was supported by Carter and then Ronald Reagan all through the 1980s when he waged his war against Iran, and had been a client all through that time. And now he's Hitler. And what he's going to do is he's going to take over Saudi Arabia. And then I don't know if they even bothered mentioning Iran, but whatever. He's going to end up taking over the whole Middle East. And then he's going to monopolize the entire world's oil supply. And then he's going to march on Paris. And we'll all be enslaved by the new Adolf Hitler, Saddam Hussein, who actually has this ramshackle old Soviet tank force that couldn't possibly make it to Lebanon. You know what I mean? Like, what are we talking about? But they built him up as such a Hitler that now they couldn't bring him in from the cold. Now it wasn't like, okay, you lost a fair fight. And so, but now we can try to sort of normalize relations again. Now it was the sanctions regime has to stay until he's gone. And then one more thing about this real quick, and then I'll shut up, is that then the Israelis had a new policy in Bill Clinton's first year in 1993 that said that you have to stay in Saudi to blockade Iraq and Iran, or, contain them both, because we beat up on Iraq so badly that now Iraq wasn't powerful enough to balance against Iran. So now Israel insisted America has to stay and do the dual containment policy, which was furthering the same Bush Sr. Dick Cheney blunder of not just waging Iraq War I, but then leaving those bases in Saudi Arabia through the end of the century, which is the proximate cause of the kamikaze strike on our towers and Pentagon on September 11th. And for that matter, all the al-Qaeda terrorist attacks on the United States throughout the 1990s leading up to it too.
Well, and they've continued to serve in that role as a massive instigation or even just a target. I'm sure you remember at the conclusion to, Operation Midnight Hammer, which we can't prove it, but in my mind, it seems to be that there were some back channel negotiations going on saying like, look, we'll blow up a mountain, say we got your base, you guys hit one of our air bases. But wait a minute, why can the Iranians reach one of our air bases? Well, it turns out we still have them there, sort of as a tripwire, right? Should we need, I guess I can't prove that, but speculation has suggested, right? Should we need a reason to, go to war with Iran? Obviously, following the chronology, during the Clinton years, we see relationship with Dick Cheney and another relevant piece of this puzzle, which is Halliburton, a name that's, again, kind of faded from popular consciousness. So could you just briefly describe Halliburton and then Dick Cheney's relationship, alleged or not, with that company?
Yeah. So in the 1990s, I think he got that job. I'm sorry, I forget which year it was, but it was, just after the Bush administration had left power. And they hired him thinking that, well, he's connected to the DOD, so he's going to be able to get them a lot of sweet government contracts. But the reality was that during the Clinton years, he just didn't really have that much juice with the DOD. And
to be fair, at the same time, the Army was being downsized, generally speaking. Like there was not nearly the same amount of money flying around. Sorry, back to you, Scott.
No, that's okay. And see, Halliburton and Kellogg Brown and Root, which is their major subsidiary, their specialty is oil services. That is mostly building pipelines and infrastructure for transporting oil and I guess refining it too, and so forth. And so, they do, and they have projects like that around the world as well. One of the things that really caught my attention in the 1990s was Dick Cheney. It was funny because it wasn't the substance that got anyone's attention, like in the very dumbest sort of popular press. It was the scandal that Dick Cheney criticized America because he criticized Bill Clinton's policy from overseas. He gave a speech in Australia. He had made these comments numerous times, but then at one point he gave a speech like this in Australia where he denounced Bill Clinton's sanctions against Iran because he said we should be building oil pipelines out of the Caspian Basin across Iran. And he said, I forget if this was in the Australia speech or not. Don't hold me to that. But he did say during that era as Halliburton's CEO, God didn't see fit to put all the oil under our Democratic friends' ground. So we have to do business with these other countries. But of course we can. I mean, you could, for all the fear mongering and all the hype out of Dick Cheney, anyone ought to be able to easily picture the very same man saying, I ain't afraid of no Ayatollah. America is an 800 megaton gorilla. Nobody messing with us. We'll build an oil pipeline across Iran if we feel like building an oil pipeline across Iran. What is there to dispute about? But you know the answer. The Israel lobby said no. And I should add that it wasn't just Cheney, but in fact, Zbigniew Brzezinski, who was a Rockefeller guy, and, you know, the Rockefellers, of course, had major interest in Iran pre-revolution. And Alexander Haig, who had been Henry Kissinger's guy, and he was a Rockefeller guy too, from the old, more realist Council on Foreign Relations type establishment. They also wanted to build oil pipelines across Iran to, one, make money, two, bring them back in from the cold after the revolution. What are we going to do? Have a Cold War against Persia forever? This is ridiculous. And of course, to the Israeli government, that was the status quo that they demanded. And they won on all of that to this day. Now, the Brits, of course, British Petroleum has major interests in Iran, but no major American corporation does during this whole time. Now, I wrote about this in the book, and maybe I should enough already. I mean to say, my second book. I should maybe delve further into this because I did read criticism of this saying that I didn't know what I was talking about, and it seemed like that guy did know what he was talking about. That would require me to dig further, but I did find where, and it was a real scandal at the time, that Dick Cheney, when he was the CEO of Halliburton, he and his CFO or COO, or which I think is CFO, did not do their diligence right before buying a company called Dresser Industries, which was this major industrial concern, manufacturing concern or whatever thing. And that Dresser was right then, just weeks away after the ink was dry on the page. They started getting lawsuits against them coming in, on the side of the plaintiffs. And in total, it started out, it was like tens and then hundreds. It ended up more than $1 billion in asbestos cancer claims against Dresser. And all that got hung around Halliburton's neck. And I found where that was a big deal in the business press. And Cheney and his guy were completely humiliated by it and had to answer for it publicly and all of this stuff. And now I wrote about that in the book as an example of, and see, I guess I do admit that I forget where I had read about this previously, where this is not an original idea of mine. Someone else had written quite about this, not just the incident, but about the role that it played in Cheney's thinking later about, boy, he better make Halliburton rich now that he has the chance as vice president kind of thing. I had read that elsewhere, but I don't really remember where anymore. So, I wouldn't be able to, judge present day exactly that where I got that original take from. But you can definitely find in the business press at the time where the scandal came from. Now, the criticism that I saw, I think it might have even just been in a YouTube comment, which generally is like the lowest form of human communication possible. But in this case, the guy was saying, look, man, this is just wrong. Like the guy either worked for Dresser or he worked for Halliburton or something. And he said this was just a minor hiccup and it wasn't that big of a deal. And that Dresser was a crucial purchase for Halliburton, and they profited from it immensely because Dresser manufactured this one thing that they needed so badly, and whatever, that it was a good business decision ultimately. So maybe I was out over my skis thinking that would have influenced Cheney's decision making in 2001 and 2. That he still owed them money or whatever. maybe he had been like, so how do you like that, guys? It turned out that we ended up making a lot of money off that deal anyway. And it was fine. Like, I really don't know. And maybe I could try to do more research into that. But it was definitely a scandal at the time. And there's no question that when he got in there, that is I don't really know about Afghanistan. I'd have to look at that. There's no question when it came to Iraq and even just, basing inside the United States, that Halliburton and Kellogg Brown and Root got massive contracts in the hundreds of billions of dollars throughout the entire 8 years of that thing. And scandalously and infamously, no bid contracts where there's just nobody else allowed in the room, where they get to go like it's a Russian auction for a nickel concern or something. They get to go in there and bid on it with no one to compete with and get whatever they want. So whether that was his thinking, like overall driving his motivation, of course, is anybody's guess, but you could definitely see where he was cashing in on that.
Oh, 100%. Like there are several things there. One, as regards the asbestos scandal, my reading list is no doubt significantly different to yours. And that was a scandal I was aware of as well. And what's interesting is that the timeline between the two, that didn't come out until I believe 04 or 05. I'm not entirely sure, but there was a significant amount of air gap between when that actually happened and when it came out in the press, which is interesting. Likewise, I think it's important to remember that a large portion of the scandal had to do with effectively Dick Cheney and, as you said, one of the other C-suite members deliberately obfuscating those payouts in accounting in order to avoid oversight. Basically, like, oh shoot, we've got to hide this, launder this somewhere else. It's been a really long time since I've dug into that scandal, so take everything I say with a grain of salt. But as far as I remember, that was the really juicy part. Not simply, and I'm not saying you said that Cheney made a boneheaded decision. He didn't do his due diligence. But once that happened, he was willing to cover it up.
Yeah.
Take that as an indictment of his character, if you will. Now, obviously, we're chronologically coming up to the second Bush regime. But it's important to remember that even though, Cheney will be re-entering public life, he still had, as you've said, ties to Halliburton. Both, obviously he wanted to, reward his friends, but also enrich himself. He himself still owned, shares, options in the company. And as regards those sort of no bid contracts, you start to wonder, like, well, what's really the motivation? I believe the most commonly circulated number is $40 million plus or minus, which is a whole lot of money in the mid 2000s. A whole lot of money now, but so it's just something I wanted to bring up. So
no, that's good. And let me add to that real quick that, there's that old thing about, people don't like the truth that their salary depends on them remaining ignorant of or whatever kind of thing. Well, there's like corollaries to that about how, you could be making money off of a thing and that would really help encourage you to think that it's a great idea, not just, that you be like reluctant to criticize it. But for example, like, let's just say that instead of having, very strict kind of ideas against conflicts of interest in government and business, let's just say we were Heritage Foundation types or American Enterprise Institute types, we'd say that, and you and I could agree on this, like not on a moral level, but like on a just descriptive type level, that on some things, it probably really would make sense to have private contractors doing things instead of specialist first class, like say peeling potatoes or driving the laundry truck or whatever. Who knows? Maybe even some intelligence things or whatever, right? Forget all conflicts of interest, but just might it work better to have soldiers focus on soldiering instead of having, Klinger sitting there peeling the potatoes, wasting his day, when that could be
right. It probably doesn't make sense to have an army MOS for like keeping the parking lot clean and the landscaping done.
So now if we're all Democrats, then socialism is perfect. What's the problem? But if you're a Republican, then you go, no, we should privatize as much of this as possible. It's sort of the same thing with the prisons. You can imagine that a private company would run a more efficient prison. Well, now there are other drawbacks to that, like what's getting cut, medical care for desperate captives, who may or may not have actually done anything other than commit an offense against the state, or lobbying by prison companies that, like, Senator, you promise you keep my prison at least 98.7% full at all times. We need your cops to get out there and round us up some more population for our jail. Now, that's different, but more efficient. That's the kind of argument that Dick Cheney could believe in. And so it makes sense then to give the devil his due, that Cheney would have believed that, yes, why would you have the army build all their own tents and crap? We'll have our guys do that. You know what I mean? So I'm not letting the guy off the hook, but I also just got to be fair like I was saying, like, yes, he's got his own financial interests involved. His wife's sitting on the board of directors of Lockheed. He absolutely has a direct financial interest involved. But also, I bet he would say, like, what are you going to do? Nationalize Lockheed? You want that to be a private company supplying these arms to the Pentagon, right? You know what I mean? So same thing about
there's a big gap.
As much of this as possible, Yeah,
there's a huge gap between like the theoretical advantages and this particular administration in particular, right?
Sure.
Like looking at that, man, what he did. Because I agree with you, right? Like conceptually, there's all number of things which make much more sense. I mean, we see this in, other, military, items. I mean, depending on, what you're interested in, whether it's vehicles or weapons, that having some sort of competition is beneficial, right? It makes a ton of sense until exactly as you mentioned, the human side of it comes in. And I'm not saying, obviously it's sort of outside the scope of the show where I fall on that. Everything should be privatized. Everything should be nationalized. But you can definitely look at Cheney and his family and say, wait a minute, there seems to be a conflict of interest here. You don't have to get your tinfoil hat to connect the dots there.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, on the policy, and the most crucial one here, it's important to point out that Cheney had said publicly at least twice, one question in front of a committee of, I'm not exactly who all was in the room with him there, and another time he's at AEI and he's questioned by, I think the questioner must have simply been working directly for C-SPAN. I don't think he was a partisan type. I think he was like just doing like straight down the line journalism, just asking common questions kind of thing. If I remember it right. Anyway, Cheney explains why it was smart for Bush Sr. to not go all the way to Baghdad in 1991. And he says, well, Iran would get the South. Scratch the record. Hold it right there. Wait, what? Why would Iran get the South? Oh, because that's where the Iraqi Arab Shiite Muslim super majority, 60% super majority of the population of the country lives. Adjacent to Iran, co-religionists with Iran. Some of their most important religious leaders fled to Iran when the Shiites took over that country in the revolution of 1979 and sided with them in the Iran-Iraq war. Again, this is why when Bush Sr. and his government encouraged the Shiite uprising in southern Iraq in 1991, they changed their mind and let Saddam Hussein instead kill 100,000 people to crush that insurrection. You guys are probably too young for this too, but there's a movie called Three Kings. If anybody's ever seen that, it's got Marky Mark and Ice Cube and George Clooney. And it's a gold heist. They're American soldiers stealing gold. But the setting is it's the aftermath of Iraq War I, and they're occupying southern Iraq. And the Shiites are uprising against Saddam, and Saddam's killing them all. And Marky Mark and Ice Cube are caught up in the whole thing. That's the setting of the movie there. So for like, people need a touchstone of this, being a thing that happened. Fiction ought to help you. I don't know. It's where he pours the oil down Marky Mark's throat and he goes, here's your stability. You need stability? Eh? But what he should have said was, here's Israel's oil for you. Because that was, well, we'll get to that in a second. But anyways, point being that, so Dick Cheney was right when he says that to AEI in 94, that Iran would have a major sway over Shiite southern Iraq. And I don't know what we're going to do about that. And then he says, and then we go to Baghdad to get Saddam Hussein. Now the war ain't over until we get him, because otherwise he could come back. And that could take a long time. Well, yeah, in fact, it took a year and a half. They didn't get him until the end of 2004 when they did finally invade in March of 2003. Okay. So he was right about that. And he said, our guys would be caught in urban combat. In other words, driving down the road, getting blown up by landmines and sniped from rooftops. Yeah. Thousands of them. And he said, this is crazy. Why would we do this? And then he says, the Kurds in northern Iraq, that could cause problems with our friends, the Turks, who have their own problems with the Kurds in their country. And then I think this doesn't really make sense. He says the Syrians would like to run off with Western Iraq. I don't think that Assad thought that he could have had sway over Western Iraq. However, once Obama started backing the bin Ladenites in Syria, they wanted Western Iraq. And so Obama later made that part of Cheney's scaremongering come true after the Ba'athists were not an issue in eastern Syria anymore, and they created the caliphate there in 2014. But anyway, so how did he change his mind? He changed his mind because he was surrounded by the neoconservatives. And I guess I'll stop here to ask you, how deeply do you want me to explain who the neoconservatives are? Because we really are here for Dick Cheney's scalp, and that's a hell of a quest. Like it could be, depending on how quickly I do it or how deep we want to go into that. But it was Cheney and the neocons who did what they did, if you want to know the shape of the thing in the W. Bush years there.
Let's fly through it quickly because my audience has probably heard enough of me whining about neocons for the last 2 weeks for all of the reasons you can assume. So I think it's probably fresh, but it does bear mention.
Right. Okay. So the deal is this. You had a bunch of people in the first generation who had sided with communism, like in the Great Depression era and that kind of thing. But a lot of them were Trotskyites. And Trotsky, of course, was exiled by Stalin and murdered. And then America fought first of all, all the truth of the show trials and Stalin's crimes really came out. And then we fought the Second World War in alliance with Stalin, but then the Cold War immediately set in. And these ex-communists, they were moving already to the right, the first generation of them, and they sided with America against the Soviet Union in the Cold War, even though they had just come from the far left, because one, they're actually from here, not there, and two, it's Stalin's Soviet Union, not their dream of Trotsky's Soviet Union, which is now already canceled. And some of them were ex-Stalinists and had just been disillusioned by the reality of his brutality. I guess the Holodomor had really been covered up originally, but when that started all coming to light and the show trials and all that, more and more American communists turned against him. Now, after World War II, all the people who had been the leaders of the old right, they were mostly all growing old and retired and dead, essentially. And there was a whole kind of new generation of people coming in, and they were led by William F. Buckley and others who, as we all know, purged everybody who wasn't an ex-commie out of the movement. And so that was the John Birchers, once they got anti-war at least, and then included avowed racists and included the Ayn Randians and included the Rothbardian libertarians as well, because Murray Rothbard was absolutely against the Cold War with the Soviet Union. And they just said, you cannot write for the National Review if you hold those positions. And so they preferred to bring in people like James Burnham and Sidney Hook and Whittaker Chambers and all of these others who had been Reds to come and lead the new conservative movement and making the right synonymous with the neocons and making all of that synonymous with support for the Cold War against the USSR. As Buckley wrote in 1952, we must support a totalitarian bureaucracy on our shores, even with Truman at the reins of it all, in order to contain the Soviet Union and fight the Cold War. And as essentially what they call moderates, but not really, centrists on domestic policy, they could be, they were in agreement on that. What the Cold War liberals and the Cold War conservatives could all agree that, yeah, we do need to create and sustain this massive superstate at home so that we can wage a world empire to contain the Reds abroad. And since the real right-wingers were too crusty and were too penny pinching and were too isolationist for that game, they all got kicked out and usurped by the neoconservatives. So that's at least the first generation. I'm sorry, because you asked me to go fast and that wasn't fast, but I'll speed it up in a second, but go ahead.
Oh, no, not at all. And this is where we see the birth of the post-war consensus, a phrase which has been widely demonized by primarily the ideological descendants of these exact men we're talking about. This is that sort of like duopoly where you have both sides that, as you've said, are not particularly opposed on domestic or foreign policy. And so politics becomes very, very narrow. The scope of what is allowable, what you can actually disagree on when you really get down to it, is very narrow, because everyone agrees the Cold War and the kind of increased, or the massive bureaucracy at home, that cannot be challenged. And I mean, look, obviously we're in a moment now where it seems as if the neocons are now second or third generation, depending on how you want to split it, are in that same position. They are old, they are crusty, they are mentally infirm, and they're sort of thrashing around like a dying animal, which I'll be honest, I am getting a whole lot of personal satisfaction from.
Yeah.
The point is, right, these people had an immense amount of sway over America during the second half of the 20th century. And Buckley was obviously still around during both Bush regimes, but we sort of see this, this kind of second generation of neocons. You have many of the sons, either literally or kind of the mentees of the first generation, both staffing and encouraging Bush too, right, yelling like, yes, let's go for it. You see, obviously, you see figures like Frum and French, and also Bill Kristol, his father, Irving Kristol, was sort of a titan of the first generation. I mean, that sort of incestuous world is very much at the forefront of this war, just as they were pushing the Cold War.
Yep. Yep, that's absolutely right. And as you can see with all of the controversy over Tucker Carlson and everything in the news, war and peace is the dividing line on all of this. And, the conflation mostly of Israel's interests with America's, I don't know, mostly that's a huge facet of it. But let me just say real quick, and I'll just sum this up very quickly. There are a few avenues in for the neoconservative movement. There's the National Review. There's the group of the followers of a guy named Max Schachmann, who had been Trotsky's most important guy in the country and ended up moving right. And he was the leader of the Social Democrats USA and the Young People's Socialist League, which was like a subset of that. And that included a bunch of neocons like Elliot Abrams, Joshua Moravchik, and Gene Kirkpatrick, and others. Then you had Albert Wohlstetter and Leo Strauss at the University of Chicago, and then their students, which included Pearl, Feith, Khalilzad, I forget if David Worms or not.
Jaffa or
a bunch of these guys. Yes, and there are East Coast and West Coast Straussians too, where I think the West Coast guys were less warlike and more academic, and the East Coast guys were more the Cold War Democrats and apparatchiks. And a lot of them went to work for Scoop Jackson, who was the senator from Washington State. They called him the senator from Boeing. And then they became Reaganites. And part of that was they were rebelling against essentially the excesses of the new left in the 60s on civil rights and, affirmative action and all that stuff domestically. And also because they were hippies and anti-war. And, I think they cared less about Vietnam, but they care a lot about that martial spirit. And the hippies also, and I don't know very much about this, but apparently did not all rally around Israel in the 67 war either. And these guys decided they really wanted to move right. And then quite a few of them got jobs in the Reagan administration as like Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Arms Control and Security, or this kind of thing that you wouldn't hear of. And at the same time, they were making their alliance with the military-industrial complex. And a lot of this has to do with social class too. And I'm not the world's expert on this, but you can read about this, that a big part of this was in those days, the Council on Foreign Relations was still very like Brooks Brothers, waspy wasp type folks, and Jews and Catholics weren't really allowed, or at least not in very large numbers. And so they said, well, screw you. We'll just make our own think tanks. And they joined in allegiance with the military industrial complex and formed these tight associations with the Bradley, Olin, and Scaife foundations, and with Lockheed and Boeing and Northrop Grumman and the rest. And through those financial ties, they were able to then take over the Heritage Foundation. I don't know when Hudson was created, but they at least took it over if they didn't create the thing in the first place. They, absolutely took over the American Enterprise Institute. Then they created their whole forest of new ones, from the Committee on the Present Danger to the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, later with the Center for Security Policy, the Project for a New American Century, and later the Foreign Policy Initiative and all these things. Jim Loeb one time described this forest of think tanks as a bunch of pieces of paper in Bill Kristol's secretary's desk drawer, right? Where like they just keep filing these papers and creating these new groups. A lot of them will share the same business address, but there's all a small group of guys. And then of course they took over created the Weekly Standard magazine. That's Irving Kristol's son. They always had run Commentary magazine, and they had eventually total sway over the National Review, with, the kind of sock puppet hireling Lucien Goldberg's child, Jonah Goldberg, to sit as editor, running Michael Ledeen and all of the worst of the neocons. And so they had just completely captured right-wing institutional groups and conservative media. From the very launch of Fox News, the neocons were at the very forefront of like, hey, I'm your expert. Talk to me about everything, and ran, all Republican associated hawks. And then their major effort in the end of the 90s was the Project for a New American Century. And this was led by Bill Kristol, but all the usual suspects. And the goal was first to push for the Iraq Liberation Act of 1998, which they got and Bill Clinton signed, and which Ron Paul warned is a declaration of war and will lead to war in the next administration, almost certainly. And of course was correct about that. And then they wrote all these open letters to Clinton and then later to Bush, demanding regime change and the rest. So then to understand the era of September 11th and the advent of the W. Bush administration and all that, what you had was out in the world, you had all these think tanks, the National Review, the Weekly Standard, Fox News, and for that matter, the editorial pages of the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, and the New York Times as well. Not that they were all completely dominated by neoconservatives, but pretty much from, David Brooks and Fred Hyatt at the Washington Post, and then Bill Kristol and all the kooks at the Wall Street Journal. I mean, it was extremely neocon heavy, all of that. So they just completely dominated this massive echo chamber of opinion on the national security right. It's not to say that they dominated all opinion out in talk radio land in the country where right-wingers got their information and talked to each other. They, and I will say we for that matter, were much more isolationist. For example, totally opposed, or non-interventionists, that's their smear for us, but whatever, totally opposed the war against Serbia to break off Kosovo in 1999, for example, where the neoconservative movement and all the leaders of the Republican Party, all the John McCains and all the neoconservative hawks, all were, of course, for it. And the Weekly Standard, had famously said that the Serbs do what we say because they know that we'll kick their skulls in if they dare to oppose us, and all that. That's and I have the footnote in Provoked for you there. It's David Tell is the guy that wrote that in Bill Kristol's Weekly Standard. So that's who the neocons were out in the world. Then inside the W. Bush government, it was Cheney, because W. Bush didn't know what the fuck, he didn't know. It was Cheney who hired all of these guys, and and he knew what he was doing. And so in the vice president's office was Scooter Libby and John Hanna and Robert Joseph and Eric Edelman. And I think Addington.
Scooter Libby, he becomes relevant again with another Dick Cheney scandal, right? A leak from somewhat later in his career.
Yeah, I mean, like a few months later.
Yeah.
But so Libby also had the job of being special assistant to the president. In other words, Dick Cheney would tell Scooter Libby, go tell the president this, go tell the president that. Okay. So he had Libby, Hanna, Joseph, and Edelman in the vice president's office. Then on the National Security Council, he had Elliot Abrams. Well, first of all, Stephen Hadley was the deputy national security advisor under Condoleezza Rice, even though she was not a neoconservative. She was much more of a Brent Scowcroft realist type, along with Robert Zoellick and Robert Blackwell and a couple of others. But beneath her was Stephen Hadley, who was definitely Cheney's man. And then also was Zalmay Khalilzad and Elliot Abrams on the National Security Council. So that's there's a few others that I'm forgetting. You mentioned David Frum was a speechwriter, and he worked very closely with Richard Pearl, later wrote a book together. So I may be leaving out a couple of the lesser neocons in the vice president's office and in the White House, but that's the main cast in the White House. Then at the State Department, you had David Wormser and John Bolton. Now, Bolton is not a neoconservative. He was never a leftist of any kind or a liberal of any kind. He's just a lifelong kind of Barry Goldwater nationalist, but is a extreme hawk on everything and is very close to the neoconservatives and agrees with them about everything, is extremely Zionist, extremely against any arms control and all of that stuff. And when I say arms control, I'm not talking about gun control at your house. I'm talking about treaties on nuclear weapons proliferation, okay? This is different. He's not a neocon, but he's very close to them. Now, David Wormser is extremely important in this. He was an author of The Clean Break, really the principal author of The Clean Break and that whole doctrine for Netanyahu and why America ought to get rid of Saddam Hussein, and one of their major, supposed thinkers. And he was there with with Bolton, working for Dick Cheney to keep a leash on Colin Powell and his right-hand man, Dick Armitage. Because Powell, even though obviously he had his own history and everything and was willing to go along with this and eventually help lie us into war, he was one of the most reluctant warriors there. And he served Bush loyally to a fault, but he was a voice of caution. And Dick Armitage, too, was a guy who, knew what he was doing. So they were a formidable team. And so it was important that Cheney waged this kind of minor war against them to limit their influence and to limit, importantly, the influence of the Bureau of Intelligence and Research, which is the State Department's own CIA intelligence branch. And they can debunk your lies all day. So they had to be reined in and excluded and all of that. So that was an important part of that mission. Then at Defense, you had Deputy Secretary of Defense Paul Wolfowitz. And beneath him, Deputy Secretary of Defense for for Policy, Douglas Feith. Ken Bone was intelligent. Then you have on the Defense Policy Board, and very importantly, although people would say, oh, well, that's not meaningful. Oh, it's extremely meaningful at this time and place. It was Richard Pearl was the boss. Then they also had Eric Edelman and Newt Gingrich, again, not a neoconservative, but very close to them, the former Speaker of the House in the Clinton years, and extremely close to them. Gene Kirkpatrick and Elliot Cohen from Heritage, and I'm sorry, there are 2 or 3 others on the Defense Policy Board. And then, but importantly, back upstairs, under Douglas Feith, the Deputy Secretary of Defense for Policy, was a guy named Abram Shulsky, and he ran the Office of Special Plans. And that included Michael Rubin and Michael Ledeen and others. And across the hall was David Wormser again, as he was shuffling back and forth. And Wormser worked with a guy named Michael Maloof, and they set up a group called the Policy Counterterrorism Evaluation Group. And their job was digging through the CIA and other trash to try to find links between Iraq and Al-Qaeda. Whereas the Office of Special Plans was focused on digging through the CIA's trash and funneling in lies from the Iraqi exile group, the Iraqi National Congress, about Iraq's weapons and mass destruction programs. And it was here was what they called, Jason Vest and Robert Dreyfuss called it the lie factory, in a fantastic article from Mother Jones that they wrote about this. And in fact, if people want to read all about this, I actually quote tweeted it today. You can find on my Twitter today. Said, oh, I'm doing Jay Burden's show later. I better read up on Dick Cheney and the neocons. And then it's a thread of about 30 or 35 articles about the neocons and how they lied us into war. All really good stuff that I've been collecting over the years. And, it's part of my job at antiwar.com at the time was not losing track of any of these. So it's a really good thread of articles. And I was actually rereading it a bit today in preparation for the show and getting reminders of stuff. Oh, and I left out Harold Rode. He was in the Office of Net Assessment over there, working with Andrew Marshall also to kick all the real experts out and replace them with kooks from the think tanks. And these are the guys who lied us into war in Iraq War II.
Yeah, well, it's one of the interesting things is that even well after these claims were debunked, the idea of bringing, I think it was uranium from Niger, and then the whole like aluminum tubes narrative. Even after, well after those had been disproven, it was widely accepted. He just kept running with them. He'd just keep referencing them constantly, as if it had just no one had ever challenged those ideas. Yep. Which again, the guy's dead, and I assume even if he wasn't, he probably wouldn't be particularly eager to talk to either one of us. But did he not know? Did he not care?
Oh,
who knows?
Yeah.
Okay. I can't prove it.
One example that, the aluminum tubes is a good one. I'm glad you brought that up. So anyone can find this. It's September the 9th, 2002. Joby Warwick debunks the aluminum tubes in the Washington Post. I still remember, and in fact, you can find it on the Wayback Machine. You can find antiwar.com's front page from that day. And it's like halfway down. It's just this little old lazy link to page 43 in the Washington Post about how these aluminum tubes are for rockets. And that is a fact, Jack. And we know for a fact. And why? Because they're shipped to the same place where the other ones were shipped, where they make rockets out of them. And they are not fit for centrifuges. They could not possibly be fit for centrifuges, which have to be extremely high quality manufacturer with, their tensile strength of this, that, whatever, all this stuff. And it was just anyone at the energy department, anyone at Sandia or Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory, and even David Albright, who I suspect is an Israeli agent and helps lie about America's, things a lot. And in fact, he vouched for the lies about Iraq's chemical weapons during that time, but he debunked this. He told Joby Warwick, man, I'm sorry, dude, what do you want me to say? You can't use that for a centrifuge. Well, that was in September. So what about October, November, December, January, February, March? They just kept pretending that you're supposed to be afraid of these aluminum tubes. Dave Chappelle did a skit about it. He goes, get it? Aluminum tubes, man. Aluminum. Get it? Like, you're just, what? What the hell is supposed to be scary about an aluminum tube? You know what you can do with an aluminum tube? You can make a Katusha rocket to fire out of the back of your mini truck. That's got a range of like 300 yards or something, man. Right? It's 500 yards. What are you talking about?
It is not quite a weapon of mass destruction, to put it mildly. Like,
yeah,
it's just absurd.
Yeah.
So,
and what would they need with a bunch of centrifuges? Oh, you're telling me they have a Manhattan project in Iraq of massive cascades of centrifuges enriching uranium to weapons grade to make atom bombs with, but we just can't find that anywhere. But like, just trust us, dog. Cause like, yeah, no, it's like that. Give me a break. The whole thing was preposterous. And for anyone who didn't believe, they could see right through it. I mean, I'm from Austin, where you can say, yeah, cause okay, fine. Everyone in Austin's a Democrat. All right, fine. But still, like, you could find just any average idiot off of the street. My bartender friend, Joey, could tell you, like, none of this is true, dude. They're lying. Saddam Hussein, you see how he shaves his chin every morning and wears a beret like a Frenchman? That means that he's not a Bin Ladenite, dude. Get it? This is a hoax, man. That he's gonna give weapons that he doesn't have to terrorists that he's terrified of to attack the United States as a we don't know Baghdad's return address. And he's going to attack us with Iraq is going to attack the United States of America with chemical weapons. And he's going to use Bin Ladenites to deliver them on us. You see how this is so damn stupid? How the people in your neighborhood who went along with this, they had to want to, man. It's not an accident that half the population of the country knew better. You know what I mean?
Well, and I think a big part of it, like, at least from like a psychological level, it's like, well, what was the purpose of the American empire? Like, ever since World War II? Well, it's to fight a big war against the communists. Well, where'd all the communists go? Now, what is the purpose of America? I guess we have to find something new to fight. It's Islam, terrorists. That's what we care about. What's scary about these big wars? Nukes, I guess. Just kind of all throwing it at the wall. And obviously, that isn't true when we talk about a man like Cheney. He knew exactly what he was getting out of this. But I think for a lot of people, it's just, that's what America does. We save the war from bad people. And whoever the bad people are, well, we just all get together and decide that guy's Hitler and we know what we need to do. It's time to, dress up and play World War II all over again. And I think that that's a big part of the reason people wanted to go along with it. Because it's cool to think that you're the hero of the world, right? That you can save the day from, the evil dictator. There were a couple other scandals.
In the way that people just turned away from the war. As soon as the suicide bombing started, like a couple of months later, people were like, okay, well, whatever, back to reruns. Like, it was so exciting and fun when we're doing this, but then the war goes on for 8 more years. But nobody cares anymore. It's not even like in the background on sitcoms. Like, if you were just watching regular TV that was coming out in that era, the war's not even in the background as like a shadow cast member of like, we live in the terror war era or any of that. You could have watched every episode of Third Rock from the Sun, and there's no mention of the fact that this is the era of total war, that Dick Cheney, in fact, has instructed George W. Bush that because you're the president in wartime, there is no law that can bind your power, not even the Constitution itself. it grants you the power of commander in chief. And that is the power of God on earth. And what that means, sir, is that you can and you must torture people to death if you have to get them to falsely implicate Saddam Hussein for supporting Al-Qaeda. And which is funny to me, because why don't you just make up a lie and just say, look, Abu Jimmy Jam told us that he's friends with Saddam. Why do you got to find a real guy who's friends with Osama and then rip his fingernails out until he says, yeah, fine. Saddam Hussein taught me how to make chemical weapons, which is what they did to this guy, Sheikh Ibn al-Libi. They turned him over to the Egyptians, and the CIA and the Egyptians tortured the guy within an inch of his life. And he goes, oh, yeah. Saddam Hussein, he taught us all about how to hijack planes and do terrorism. They'll still tell this lie to this day, that this police training facility at Salman Pak, where their job was to practice, one of the things there was a airplane fuselage for cops to practice raiding a plane for anti-terrorist training. If somebody hijacked a plane, how to liberate the plane from the hijackers. And then they go, aha, a fuselage. See, Saddam Hussein is training terrorists. Here, we're going to torture this guy until he says that the fuselage is there, because that's where Saddam trains us how to hijack airplanes. Also, he trains us how to make chemical weapons. And by the way, Gaddafi murdered this guy in prison in a case of Arkansas later, when he was working for the United States in that short period of time before Barack Obama betrayed him again.
Yeah, I mean, a couple things there. And look, I'm not saying that if, Dick Cheney spent the last few years of his life, touring the nation saying, I messed up, it was all a giant scam, I would completely and totally forgive him. I mean, it would have made it better. But far from it. He spent the rest of his career in politics, effectively, even, once he was out of office, defending enhanced interrogation and what was the other euphemism? Rectal rehydration. Like, I'm not going to get into details, but it's not pleasant stuff. And to your point, like, I'd almost respect it more if they just, brutal as it sounds, took the guy out back, shot him, and said, oh yeah, right before he confessed to us what we wanted him to say anyway. Like, it's just as heartless, but at least you don't have to go through the sham, the rigmarole of torturing this guy within an inch of his life to get him to make something up. Right? It's just this like absurd extra level of cruelty that seems to be completely and totally useless. Right? I don't know.
And it is. And they had to lie to say it was useful. I mean, you can watch in the movie Zero Dark 30. They pretend that they tortured the truth of bin Laden's whereabouts out of some guy, but that's not true at all. And my wife had the story, frankly, a couple of years before Seymour Hersh did. And Seymour Hersh got the story and he got it right, that it was a Pakistani walk-in who walked right in the American embassy and said, I'll give you bin Laden, give me my money, and turned him over. And that was how they knew he was there. They lie. That disgusting Jessica Chastain or whatever lies that it was torture that led to the killing of that dog.
Yeah. In total, there are other things to talk about with Cheney. I mean, you could write a whole book about this guy, sort of a vituperation, I think is the opposite of a hagiography. Anyway, point is, you could dig into this guy for hours, but he's no longer with us. Something to celebrate. Maybe he'll get justice in the next life, if not this one. But Scott, I appreciate your expertise. I appreciate you coming back on. You've got a new program, something new that you've launched. Do you want to tell my audience about it before we wrap up?
Yeah, sure. Thanks for the opportunity to do so. This is a project I've been working on for most of the last year here. It's the Scott Horton Academy of Foreign Policy and Freedom. And it's me and other experts going through long form courses on all of this stuff for you. So my course on the Middle East is about 30 hours long as I go through all of our interventions there from really this whole era that we've been talking about, but just with a lot of other facets to it. And I've got a lot of other great guests, including the great James Bovard, Ramsey Baroud, and William Bupert. We have more and more courses coming up, including C.J. Kilmer on how Woodrow Wilson is the worst person who ever lived. And Adam Francisco is, I think, as soon as next week, possibly, we're going to be publishing his new course, Debunking Christian Zionism. Not just dispensationalism, but all Christian Zionism. And I've seen the notes. It's essentially a course. This is a Lutheran scholar from Concordia University. And his course is essentially the entire history of Christians and Jews over the last 2,000 years and the role of Israel in it all and everything else. And so Tom wanted to make sure, Tom Woods chose the guy, and because Tom Woods is Catholic, but he wanted to make sure that it was a Protestant scholar who does the work here. And and really brings the knowledge probably better than maybe anybody could to discuss all this stuff. So that's going to be huge. And then I still am working on editing my course on the new Cold War with Russia, which is exceptionally long as well. And it's basically just, Tom Woods calls it Scott Horton slowed down. It's me trying to get you all caught up on everything I know, more or less, everything I've put in these books that I've been writing over the years and covering on my show over the years. And the theory is that if we can get enough people really solidly good enough on this, confident in their knowledge of this stuff, then we can really kick their ass. I mean, every time we go up against the Hawks, we win. There's just not enough of us. That neocon think tank echo chamber we were talking about earlier, we need that echo chamber of just good anti-war conservatives and populists and libertarians, and for that matter, progressives and leftists and liberals too, that just, we don't want this, man. We want our peace dividend. And quite frankly, we literally cannot afford it. Just look at the amount of interest we're paying on the debt every year to try to maintain this facade for a little while longer before it all comes crumbling down. And it is way past time to heed the sound advice of Dr. Ron Paul to roll the entire empire back and absolutely slash this budget in order to try to save this country from total economic catastrophe. And so that has to be the first step in the whole thing. And we just need an army of guys who are about as good as this stuff on me, who can get on there when I'm taking a sick day and can be on Pierce Morgan instead of me. Let's make sure that every day of the week, we always have enough guys to fill the role of standing up for peace and announcing the Hawks, and especially on the right and especially from the right. You know, this whole idea that you got to be some Vietnam era Jane Fonda hippie to be anti-war. I was even watching South Park the other day, and it was the one where the Pentagon's going to nuke our imagination to get the terrorists. And the protesters are all like white kids with dreadlocks, like W. Bush era leftist kids saying, don't nuke our imagination, bro. Like, no, dude. The anti-war movement in America now is essentially a George Washingtonian movement in favor of this Constitution and in favor of following his sound advice from the farewell address, which is, of course, the same thing that Jefferson and Adams and the rest of them said about America, the nation state, needs to mind its own business so as to better preserve the lives and liberty of the people of this country. And that is what this is all about now. And I believe that the narrative is with us. The power is with the war party, but the narrative out here in the country is with us. We should not have done any of this. Dick Cheney helped get the entire third millennium off on the wrong foot. The whole damn, even accepting September 11th, the whole damn terror war could have been over by Christmas. We did not have to do any of this. And it is just far past time for everyone to recognize that and to get themselves armed up in the knowledge they need to defend that position and defend it well. And so that's the purpose of the thing. That's why we put all the work into this is, as Tom Woods says, Scott Horton slowed down so everybody else can catch up and get on with this stuff. So ScottHortonAcademy.com. And I'll tell you what, I'll have my guy set this right away. So use promo code BURDEN for any time for the rest of the month, and you'll save 10% on membership to the Academy.
Well, obviously, highly recommend that, Scott. You do good work. And I think it's important, to building off what you said, to remember that, look, like America, the empire, and America, the nation are different things. And to preserve one, you sort of have to destroy the other. So when you look at really the damage wrought to the American nation and the American people, which is what I care about, it was done to feed that monster. Done to feed that monster, which is being run for the exclusive benefit of people who aren't us, who aren't like us, to quote Kamala Harris. It's a few zip codes in Northern Virginia, a few particularly wealthy politicians, and some foreign nations. Notably, not you, not me. These wars are not for us. And again, there are a few more noble uses of your time in pursuing this sort of information at Scott Horton Academy. Anyway, man, I really appreciate it. Your expertise is always appreciated. As far as my stuff, the Jay Burden Show, Apple, Spotify, YouTube, pretty much anywhere you listen to podcasts. If you want to support me, you can throw me a few bucks to get the episodes early and ad-free. It's what I do, so I appreciate your support. And I guess it's a little bit of a value add. You can also check out our sponsor, Axios Remote Fitness and Coaching. Again, Scott, I appreciate it, man. It was great.
Absolutely. Thank you very much for having me.
And everyone at home, keep your head up. Lie can't last forever. Good night.